Hi guys, so it is that time of year on BookTube. I am sure your subscription feeds have already began to flood with absolute favourite books of 2018 videos, and I am here to do my own version, of course, as I do annually. If you're not familiar, essentially I go through all the books I have read over the year by myself, not on camera, and pick out the ones that just really were the best of the best for me. They weren't necessarily published in the year of 2018, I just read them for the first time in 2018. And 2018 is a year where I have read a lot, like a lot more than normal. Over 100 books, which is, like I said, more than I would usually read. I don't think I've read over 100 books in a year since I was a child. And there are various reasons for that, and I'm going to talk more in depth about my reading year as a whole and some of like my reading stats and kind of popular genres and things that I read in a separate video, because this video can be long enough as it is. But because of that, my favourites list is also quite long, unsurprisingly. Thankfully, there were quite a lot of good books in that year of reading, and I want to make sure I get to tell you about them all. So do, like they say, get yourself a cup of something warm if it's cold where you are, and nestle down to watch this video. But these books are in absolutely no particular order. I adored them all, and I have opted to only go for one book per author. So even if there's an author who I read multiple books by that I adored this year, we're picking the best of what they wrote, because that's just a way to narrow it down, essentially. So without further ado, let's get into the book. I've sort of categorised my favourites. So the first category is Greek myth retellings, and there are two books in this list, neither of which I'm sure you'll be surprised to see here. The first one is Circe by Madeline Miller. This book, unsurprisingly, retells the myth of Circe. So Circe was the daughter of the Titan Helios, who is the generation of gods before the Olympians, with like Zeus and Ares and all of those other quite famous gods. And Helios was the god of the sun, and one of his children was Circe, whose particular brand of godly power came in the form of witchcraft, and she was in part the goddess of witchcraft. She had a lot of skill when it came to sorcery and that kind of thing in myth. And she appears in various different myths. She interacts with Odysseus, she interacts with Telemachus, Pasiphae, and you'll see her appearing over the years because she obviously has a very long lifespan. But in Circe, Madeline Miller kind of collects together all these myths and gives us an entire narrative of Circe's life from her childhood into the very, very far off future, because she does live for a very long time. And there's so much that I loved about this book. I loved that it gave Circe a whole narrative of her own. That is so rare in ancient literature for female characters of myth, to have them truly be the focus of long epic tales. So it was nice to see all of those moments in which Circe features in perhaps the story of men brought together, to see the story of Circe all fit together, and maybe how her different adventures might have affected her personality and her behaviour in later life. Obviously on a speculative level, because this was Madeline Miller's retelling. I thought it was beautifully told. She fits so much in there, so many original myths that I absolutely loved that. A few that I wasn't that familiar with, so that was really fun as well. And like I'll say for all Greek and Roman myth retellings, I just think they give you new perspective on the myth. They're an interesting sort of study really in what the myth means in a modern context, and kind of exploring that, and I thought Madeline Miller did a phenomenal job in this book. I could not put it down. And with this and the next book I'm going to mention, I had the pure joy of interviewing the author for my podcast, so I will link my interview with Madeline Miller down below, as well as my interview with Pat Barker, who wrote the second Greek myth retelling in this video, and that is The Silence of the Girls. Now this, instead of following a goddess, follows a mortal woman. This retelling is predominantly based on Homer's Iliad, which is an account of Achilles' part in the Trojan War over the course of a few days, and this follows Briseis, who was a Trojan queen whose city was sacked during the Trojan War between the Greeks and the Trojans, and she gets given as a slave to Achilles, who has to serve his every whim, predominantly as a sex slave. She becomes his concubine against her will. She has seen her city fall, her family die in front of her, and is being made to serve the man who did all of this, and it is heart-wrenching. This is a book where there are very, very few, if any, moments of lightness in the story. It's very dark, but it offers such an important perspective, I felt, on war and women's experiences of war that can be translated over so many centuries. It is drawing on an ancient war, but it feels very relevant even to today. And again, I just thought it offered a wonderful new perspective on this myth, was beautifully written, and I just was really blown away by the impact it had on me, even if it was quite harrowing to read. And again, like I said, interviewed the author, we'll link that interview down below. My next category is poetry. Now, I read quite a few collections of poetry this year actually, and I enjoyed lots of them but didn't love loads of them. Most of them were sort of 3 or 4 stars, and there was only really one 5-star poetry collection for me this year, so that's the one I've decided to mention in this video, and that is City Psalms by Benjamin Zephaniah. Benjamin Zephaniah is a poet that I already adored. I had already read multiple of his poetry collections before this one. I had read some of his children's / young adult books and just followed his career as well as his activism over the years. So I hoped to enjoy this, and I really did. I think this might be my favourite collection of Benjamin Zephaniah poetry. Of the ones I've read, there are a couple that I haven't, but I really adored this. I love Benjamin Zephaniah's rhyming and rhythm. He just, you know, pours emotion into this poetry. It's beautiful to read out loud. If you can watch YouTube videos of him performing his own poetry, I would highly encourage it. Like I said, there's just so much emotion, so much authenticity in his poem. He explores issues that have affected him as well as like wider political issues in the world, and it's all very like relevant. Although some of it's written, you know, years ago, it remains relevant to today, and it explores a lot of very important issues that affect lots of people's lives, like racism, police brutality, classism, and I just think his poems are brilliant. It's very hard, I think, to describe a poetry collection to other people. I would just advise reading one of his poems or listening to him perform one of his poems, and that'll give you a taster to see whether this is for you. But for me, Benjamin Zephaniah is one of the best poets out there, and I would highly encourage you to check him out, with perhaps this poetry collection being your first. What I'll also say actually is the language that Benjamin Zephaniah uses I find particularly accessible. He just writes poetry in a language that again seems so authentic to the way people speak and how he speaks, and his personality comes through in it, and like I said, makes it very accessible, and there's really no pretense there, and I think that's wonderful. The next category we could loosely define as literary fiction. Such a hard category to define. I mean, one of the books in here is definitely magical realism, and to be honest, both those myth retellings could probably fit into this category as well, but I have 3 literary fiction books to mention to you, and the first one is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This book I read after having been meaning to read it for years and years this year, and I have previously read quite a few books by Jeanette Winterson and loved them all, but this is probably my favourite now. This book was phenomenal, and it was actually Jeanette Winterson's debut novel. It is partially an autobiographical novel inspired by her own experiences growing up in northern England, adopted into a Pentecostal, extremely religious household with her and her 2 parents, and discovering her sexuality. So as she grows up throughout the book and starts experiencing romantic and sexual feelings, she realises that those are directed towards other girls and other women as she gets older, and it's about her self-acceptance within an environment that doesn't accept her, and it's really truly incredible how strong she feels in her own sexuality and how she refuses to deny it despite some serious objections from her mother in particular and her church and just all the people in her community, and even some of the girls she ends up having relationships with who are finding it more difficult to accept themselves. And it's just an incredible novel. Lots of elements of it, like I said, are based on Jeanette Winterson's own experiences, and that's why I think it's so affecting as a novel, although she has adapted sections of it, and there are also little magical realism elements in there which I thought were incredible and just help paint this really vivid picture. Her language is lyrical and beautiful, as it always is for Jeanette Winterson's novels, and I'd say this is probably where I'd recommend starting with Jeanette Winterson if you haven't read her before, even though it's not where I started, because I think it's a little bit less heavy-handed on the magical realism and surrealism than some of her other books, so it's probably the one that will appeal to the widest audience, and I think it's an incredible story. We then have Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. This is again a kind of coming-of-age story, although it's set only over the course of a few days and follows a young girl, I think she's in her early teens, in Mississippi in the build-up to Hurricane Katrina. And this young girl has just found out she is pregnant and is kind of processing that, not sure what to do. She hasn't told any of her family yet, and at the same time as her being pregnant and her family, who are particularly impoverished and have only one parent who isn't necessarily that supportive of her and her brothers, are trying to prepare for this hurricane warning that has been issued. Her brother's prized fighting dog is also pregnant, and she's sort of relating her experience to the dog because she doesn't really know any other women to relate her experience to, as well as the experience of Medea from Greek mythology, because that's one of her favourite subjects in school and to read about, and she particularly relates to Medea's story. And because of that, there's so many different layers, and I thought it was phenomenal. Just such an intricately woven book that only takes place across a few days, a bit like Homer's Iliad. And I think that reference to Medea added a new layer to it. But even if you're not familiar with the story of Medea, it's not a retelling of Medea anyway. It just is about how people relate to stories over time and find themselves in stories and use stories to help them understand their own experiences and situations. And I thought it was incredibly well written. And lastly, for literary fiction, we have a Japanese novel which is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaki Murata. This book really blew me away. I was not expecting to love it as much as I did, but I would recommend it to everyone. It's quite a short little novel, perhaps more of a novella, and it follows our protagonist who finds things like emotions and empathy difficult. They just don't really experience empathy or a lot of emotions that the people around them feel, so they find it difficult to relate to other people. And this young woman has grown up always like this, kind of unfazed by it. It doesn't bother her in any way, except that she finds other people's agitation about her lack of emotions stressful. So she just wants to do what they want her to do, so that she can just fit in and nobody will bother her, essentially. And while she's at college, she gets a job in a convenience store in Japan, and she really likes the rigidity and the routine of working in the convenience store that has a rule book of things she's meant to follow, and she feels like she can just fulfill that role. But it's now been many, many years, and she's continued to work in this convenience store woman, and everyone seems to think she's too old to still work in a convenience store part-time. They don't understand why she still wants to be there, and she just feels constantly questioned by everyone around her when she just loves her little convenience store. So she's essentially just trying to understand how she can just quietly exist in the world without people bothering her, and it's just incredibly well written. I found it fascinating because I got a little bit of insight into Japanese culture surrounding particularly the convenience store that I wasn't familiar with, but I found it fascinating because it does seem to be this real hubbub in Japan, and I just found her as a character really fascinating study. And even if you can't relate to her because you don't have the same experience with empathy and emotions as she does, she's still just a fascinating character to follow, and you kind of root for her because you just wish everyone would just let her get on with her stuff. And I loved it. Beautifully written, phenomenal translation, because obviously I read it in English and it's originally written in Japanese, so I commend the translator on this one because they've obviously done a fantastic job if it then came across to me as such a wonderful book as well, and I would highly recommend it to all of you. We then have two science fiction novels. Well, one that's very much a novella as it's under 100 pages, and the other one that is more of a traditional novel. So the novella will probably come as no surprise to you because I've talked about it quite a lot this year, as it was the book that really got me into an author, and that was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the first in a novella trilogy by Nnedi Okorafor that could very well just work as one book because they pick up from events of the previous books quite quickly and they're very short, and I gave all 3 5 stars, so I'm kind of just recommending that trilogy to you. But in Binti, we follow the character Binti, who is a human from the planet Earth in a far, far, far future, and she is part of a small community on Earth who definitely deal with their own sort of form of racism on Earth, but they are quite like an insular community. They're very focused on taking care of everyone in their community and creating knowledge. However, Binti has gotten into Umza University, which is a university on another planet. that has very few humans at it, let alone from her community. Nobody from her community has ever left Earth. So people are not particularly keen for her to go to this university. However, she feels this real desire to attend. So she decides to kind of sneak away early morning and board the ship with the other humans from outside of her community to travel to UMSA University. And as soon as she's on this ship, something very dramatic happens, and it is just fast-paced action from there. But despite being like an action-filled book with quite a lot of like intense things going on at quite a rapid pace, it doesn't lack in character development at all for me. It is such a wonderful character study amidst a lot of things going on, and I think those things that are going on are helping Binti discover herself and kind of challenge herself and find out who she is, how much she wants to carry on her family's traditions, and how much she wants to explore this new side of her on another planet. And it's such a wonderful, wonderful trilogy. So fascinating. Binti is such a wonderful character and you get so attached to her. I was crying in some of these novellas, trust me. Things have their real ups and downs, but they are fantastic, and they kind of explore interactions between different cultures as well, even though they're set in this science fiction future, which I think is really well done. I think Nnedi Okorafor is a wonderful writer. and I've really gotten into her as an author this year. But the next science fiction book on my list is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Now this is actually one of the first science fiction novels written by a black woman to have been published, I believe. There certainly weren't a lot before her. And this is an incredible novel. It's very highly regarded, it's received a lot of hype, and it completely deserves that. It is less hardcore science fiction, it's not set in outer space or in the future. In fact, our main character time travels back into the past, and the time travel is the only science fiction element to it. So even if you're not super into your science fiction, I think even if you're just into your historical fiction, you will enjoy this. And in this story, our main character is living in the 1970s in America, and she travels back in time to the 1800s, to a time in which American slavery is at its height, and she is a black woman, so when she travels back into this time she is considered a slave, and it's about how she adjusts to that and how it affects her living the experience that she's heard so much about. So it very much explores slavery in America, well, from a modern perspective, trying to understand what's going on there. So that's very, very fascinating, although obviously it's also written in the 70s, so it's a little bit historical in that sense too. But the reason she's time travelling back is so that she can save the life of a white boy who's one of her ancestors. She's not sure how he becomes one of her ancestors, she's not sure how this time travel is taking place, and that isn't really the main point about the scientific aspect. The main point is the kind of historical aspect and her role in it all, and her experience meeting all these other slaves. And it is so incredibly well written. It is such an interesting concept. I've never read anything else quite like it, and like I said, I think it deserves all the praise it's received. So whether you're into science fiction or not, this is one that I would highly encourage you to read. We then have fantasy. Fantasy is a genre I've been reading a lot of this year, but I've tried not to let it overwhelm this favourites videos and really just picked out the best of the best. And the first one will come as no surprise, so I'm going to get it out of the way, and that is Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. I read 6 books by this author this year, having previously read none, 3 of which were from the Seven Waters series, which begins with Daughter of the Forest. I adored all the books I read by her. There were 5 5-stars and 1 4-star. They are all brilliant, and I did a whole video on her as an author and the books I have read. So check it out if you want more details, but a brief summary. This is a medieval Irish fantasy novel inspired by the fairy tale of the 6 Swan brothers. It is so intricately woven, such a detailed story, really slow paced, but in the most beautiful, majestic way. You feel like you're in the medieval Irish landscape. The characters are so incredibly well developed. Sorcha, our main character, is a young girl who has to save her brothers from this curse that's been put upon them by her stepmother, who is a sorceress. She faces so many struggles and it can get quite dark at times, but I think everything is explored in such genuine detail, and with really carefully by the author that none of the violence in the story feels inappropriate. And I loved Sorcha as a character. She was someone who just truly knew herself and was really committed to a task, and it was really beautiful to see. And I just fell in love with this author after this. It was actually the second book I read by her, having loved the one I read before, but this one truly cemented Juliette Marillet as my new favourite fantasy author and one of my all-time favourite authors. But I've talked about this author and these books enough for 1 year, so just watch the video if you want to hear more. The other two fantasy books that made it onto this list include one by another favourite author of mine, and that is Monstrous Regiment by Terry Pratchett. This is quite different because this is a comical fantasy book, and I have read many of Terry Pratchett's fantasy books in the past. I think I've almost read them all now. He's written over 40, I think around 40 or just over 40 of which are part of the same series called the Discworld. A book series I also have a video dedicated to if you need to know where to start, but honestly, I think you could start with this book. This book is a standalone in that it follows entirely new characters who aren't central characters in any of his other Discworld novels, and we follow at first one young woman who decides to sign up to the army, although where she is from, women aren't allowed to join the army, only men are, so she has to disguise herself as a man, and she wants to join the army in order to search for her brother, who she is unsure if he can handle himself off at war, and she needs him back at home. So she's disguised as a man to join the army, a little bit Mulan-esque, although this is a rip-roaring, hilarious adventure. There is so much pun hilarity, as in all of Terry Pratchett's books. They're so clever, and you think you know that premise, but trust me, he's going to just chuck hurdle after hurdle at your expectations when you read this novel, because it will keep you in suspense, it will keep you compelled to reading, and you will laugh along with everything that takes place. Love this book. It's now one of my new favourite Terry Pratchett books, and that's saying something since, like I said, he's written over 40. But the last fantasy book on this list is Heart of the Fae by Emma Hamm. This was a completely random discovery for me when I was on the hunt for more Fae-inspired fantasy books this year, which I am a big fan of. I love the Fae world, and this one was no disappointment. In fact, apart from Juliette Marillet's books, I think she writes my favourite Fae fantasy as it stands at the moment. And this one's actually a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. We follow another character called Sorcha in a sort of medieval Irish setting, although we quickly leave Ireland and go to the realm of the Fae, so it's not set in Ireland. And the Fae have much more of a solid role in this story than Juliette Marillet's books, in that one of the central characters is a Fae and plays the kind of beast character, whereas Sorcha is the beauty character, Beauty and the Beast. And although the initial premise is very Beauty and the Beast inspired, it very much has its own unique spin on that story, so much world building and detail that it's in no way derivative. And it also has a sequel as part of a duology which I read, which takes it away from that initial Beauty and the Beast premise and shows that the author truly has her own imagination. And I loved, again, Sorcha as a character. I thought she was just such a phenomenal, sassy woman, and I loved her. Again, she had real goals and determination. She wanted to be a healer, and a lot of people in her village, including her family, were taken ill with a certain type of plague that no one knows the cure to. So she goes to ask the fairies for help in curing them, and they send her on a quest, which leads her to a fairy island where criminal fairies, I guess, are ostracised too, and this is where she meets the Beast character of Eamon, who is a fairy prince. There is a real romantic side to this book. It's equal parts romance and fantasy, so you also follow the unfurling of a relationship. I felt like it was nicely built up. It was slowly, steadily built up. It wasn't love at first sight, which I really appreciated, and I enjoyed following their changing relationship. So really enjoyed this book and have continued to read more Emma Hamm this year, as I will do in the year to come. But those are all the fantasy books for this list, so moving on to non-fiction. The first book in my non-fiction category is Assata, an autobiography by Assata Shakur. So Assata Shakur was a civil rights activist in the United States of America who was framed, not just wrongly accused, it feels very much like a frame job, of the murder of a cop after already having been framed for a bank robbery. It's a mess, seriously. And she was put in prison, and This book tells the story of both her growing up in the United States as a young black woman, her experiences of racism, also her personal experiences with her family, as you would get in any autobiography, and flitting backwards and forwards between her childhood and her years as a young woman and her getting into the civil rights movement to the years she spent in prison and in different prisons over a long period. So for massive chunks of time she was held in male prisons and she was treated abominably. It is so disgusting the way she was treated, and to be honest, her experience is not unique. So many people are treated terribly by the incarceration system, which is a mess, particularly historically, but to be honest now as well. And it's such a relevant book despite most of the events in it taking place a few decades ago. It is still incredibly relevant to today. Eventually Assata Shakur had to flee prison despite all of this evidence that she didn't commit the crimes, which is explored in the book and has been explored elsewhere, and there was massive campaigns to free her, and became a citizen of Cuba and was put on a terrorist watch list, unable to enter the United States. But she was just treated terribly, and I think this is such an important book generally about racism, civil rights, incarceration, criminal justice, political activism, so many different layers of things, and it is such a just mind-blowing story that I would highly encourage everyone to read it. Brilliant non-fiction book that I'd love to see more people reading. And then we have a collection of essays which is Misogynation by Laura Bates, The True Scale of Sexism. So this is Laura Bates' second non-fiction book for adults. She also has a young adult non-fiction book, but her non-fiction book Everyday Sexism was such a pivotal book in my feminist non-fiction reading and just my non-fiction reading in general. It's an incredible book. So I had high hopes for Misogynation and it did not let me down, although I will say there is definite repetition between this book and Everyday Sexism, which I didn't mind because that is not a surprise. They tackle similar topics and of course certain things are going to come up again, but that means if you have read Everyday Sexism, then not everything in this book is going to be new information to you. But it still bears repeating, and as a book that stands alone, I think it's incredible. So if you haven't read Everyday Sexism, then this is also a great book to check out. And it's a collection of essays that were all originally published in newspapers. I just liked the experience of reading them as a whole, because very interestingly, they all tackle sexism, but specifically in the media in modern society. So both sexism in the media, how media propagates sexism, and just the interplay between everyday sexism and the media. So I felt like it honed in on that specific topic, and it makes you very aware of things, of insipid sexism that is just so prolific throughout your everyday experience because of media in various different formats. And it's such a well-written essay collection. I felt it resonated so much with so many of my experiences, and I just think everything in it bears repeating again and again and again, and I think Laura Bates does it in such a relatable and accessible way that I love her non-fiction writing. But the last category is contemporary fiction, one of which is young adult and the other of which is adult. So let me start with the young adult book, because I think this is actually the only young adult book in this year's favourites, although I did read some other top-notch young adult books. They just didn't quite beat these other books, and that is Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. This is another book I did an entire video on, so I'm going to be brief here. And it is a young adult book that follows our protagonist Aza, who is a young girl that suffers from OCD and anxiety disorders that lead her to become a compulsive skin picker. She also has a bit of germophobia, but she, in particular, one of the things that I related to was her compulsive skin picking of one specific wound. And although that's not something I experienced specifically as like a germaphobe that is obsessed with one wound, I do have compulsive skin picking problems associated with other anxieties that riddle my mind and mental health things that I have experienced over the years, and I related so hard to Aza. And although at some points it was difficult to read about her journey, it voiced my feelings and my experiences in a way I've really never been able to articulate myself, and because of that would love so many other people to read, because I think it could really help you relate to people that have anxiety and depression and OCD if you don't already, and also just help you articulate your own feelings if those are things you struggle with, because I think John Green does an incredible job of writing about these issues, as they are clearly things that he has experienced himself. Now there's a bit of a mystery subplot going on, but for me it was very much the mental health and the relationships that were central to the story and made it such an incredible read. And like I mentioned, I did a whole video about it, so please check that out. But the last book on this list is my last contemporary novel, and it's an adult contemporary novel, which is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. This is a book that I did not expect to love as much as I did, and it has stuck with me since I read it back in January. It follows Eleanor Oliphant, a woman in her 30s who, again, finds it slightly difficult to relate to people. It's not that she doesn't have strong emotions. She is just quite an insular, introverted person that isn't very good at interacting with others the way they expect her to, and because of that spends a lot of her time by herself. She has a very rigid routine that she sticks to every single week. However, that routine is kind of thrown off when she starts to interact with somebody at her work that she hasn't previously had a relationship with, who is a man of a similar age to her, and they both stumble across an older man having a heart attack in the street and have to help him. And this brings new people into her life, and that kind of shifts her everyday pattern in a way she wasn't expecting it to. She also has some secrets in her past that she's kind of blocked out. She's grown up in foster care after something tragic happened that you don't know what it is, and you gradually learn about throughout the story. And it's really about Eleanor Oliphant finding herself and making friends, and how kind of important friendship is and how that changes the world around you. And I thought this was such a cleverly written book. At the beginning it feels a little bit disheartening and like a little bit sad, and I wasn't certain I was going to enjoy it, but you gradually watch this woman's life change with its ups and its downs, and even if you don't always relate to Eleanor, you empathise with her. And I just found it such an engaging read with such a fascinating character, and I loved that it focused on kind of the importance of friendship and relationships with other people and how they can change your life. And I just thought it was a really wonderful, wonderful story that I wasn't expecting to love as much as I did, but like I said, has very much stuck with me and I've recommended to a lot of people. But those are my favourite books of the year. I think there was around 15 there, which is quite an impressive feat of narrowing down in my opinion, given that, like I said, I read over 100 and many of them were fantastic. But these are the best of the best books that I would encourage you all to check out from across the different genres that are all, you know, just excellent examples of what their authors and types of literature are trying to do. So I would love to know from you if you have any thoughts on the books I've talked about in this video, if you've made it to the end. I'd also love to know what your favourite books were that you read in 2018, as always, because I'm looking for some great books for 2019. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!